Mark Carney stands in front of reporters. No smile, no diplomatic language. Just this: sovereignty isn't what you claim on paper, it's what you can actually control. He just announced $7 billion for Arctic icebreakers, not to explore, not to study, to patrol, to enforce. To tell the United States that 70 years of treating Canadian Arctic waters like an American highway is over. Here's what makes this wild. Donald Trump thought threatening Canada would force them into submission. Instead, he accidentally triggered the largest Arctic military buildup in Canadian history. He handed Canada the motivation to seize control of a $900 billion trade corridor. And in doing so, he might have just shifted the global balance of power in the Arctic. This is the story of how American pressure backfired so spectacularly that it created a new geopolitical reality, one where Canada finally has the power to enforce what it's claimed for decades, and there's nothing Washington can do to stop it anymore. If you want in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe, because what's happening in the Arctic right now, it changes everything. Let's start with what the Northwest Passage actually is. It's not one route, it's a maze of waterways threading through Canada's Arctic archipelago connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. For centuries, it was a death trap. Explorers died searching for it. Ships were crushed by ice. Theoretically valuable, practically useless. Then, climate change solved the problem. Arctic ice is disappearing at an accelerating rate. The passage that was frozen solid 10 months a year is now navigable for longer periods every summer. By 2035, experts predict it could be ice-free most summers. By mid-century, potentially year-round with icebreaker support. The economic implications are staggering. A container ship traveling from Shanghai to New York through the Northwest Passage saves over 6,000 kilometers compared to the Panama Canal route. That's days of travel time, millions in fuel costs, faster delivery for time-sensitive cargo. Current projections estimate that by 2050, the Northwest Passage could handle 2 to 5% of global shipping traffic. That might not sound enormous until you realize global maritime trade is worth roughly $20 trillion annually. 2% of that is $400 billion. 5% is $1 trillion. But here's what makes it really valuable, and this is what Trump didn't understand. It's not just about shipping consumer goods. The Canadian Arctic sits on massive deposits of critical minerals, rare earth elements, nickel, copper, lithium, zinc, gold, resources essential for electric vehicles, defense systems, renewable energy technology. For decades, these deposits were economically unviable because getting them to market was impossibly expensive. No roads, no rail, no ports. The only option was flying materials out, which made mining operations prohibitively costly. The Northwest Passage changes that equation completely. Build Arctic ports, provide icebreaker support, establish shipping infrastructure, and suddenly those mineral deposits become economically viable. Canada becomes a critical mineral superpower, and whoever controls access to the passage controls the gateway to those resources. That's the $900 billion number, not just shipping fees, the total economic value of Arctic trade, resource extraction, and strategic positioning over the next 30 years. But there's a problem, a 70-year-old problem that's about to explode. Canada has claimed sovereignty over the Northwest Passage since 1946. The legal argument is straightforward. These are Canadian internal waters. The passage runs through Canadian territory. Ships should require Canadian permission. The United States never accepted this claim. Washington's position has been consistent for decades. The Northwest Passage is an international strait under international maritime law. Any vessel has the right of transit passage. Canada can regulate environmental standards, but it cannot deny access. This wasn't just a theoretical dispute. In 1969, an American oil tanker called the Manhattan sailed through the passage without asking Canadian permission. Canada was furious, but powerless. They sent icebreakers to escort the ship, trying to assert authority, but the message was clear. The United States would transit whenever it wanted. The same thing happened in 1985 with the icebreaker Polar Sea. American vessel, no permission requested, straight through Canadian Arctic waters. When Canada protested, Washington doubled down. These are international waters. We don't need permission, and we're not going to ask for it. In 1988, both countries signed the Arctic Cooperation Agreement. It was basically an agreement to disagree. The United States promised to notify Canada before American icebreakers transited. Canada got symbolic recognition, but neither side changed its legal position. The problem for Canada was enforcement. Claiming sovereignty is one thing. Actually controlling the territory is another. And for decades, Canada simply didn't have the infrastructure or military presence to back up its claims. The Canadian military had minimal Arctic capabilities, one exercise per year, a handful of rangers conducting patrols, Coast Guard ships that could only operate during brief summer months, no deep water ports, no permanent bases, no ability to actually monitor who was using the passage, let alone stop them. So the United States kept treating it as international waters. Russia built up massive Arctic infrastructure and a fleet of 50 icebreakers. China started calling itself a near-Arctic state and sending research vessels through the region. And Canada could only watch and issue diplomatic protests that everyone ignored. Then, Donald Trump made the worst strategic mistake of his presidency. When Trump started threatening Canadian trade in 2025, something fundamental shifted in Ottawa's strategic thinking. He called Canada the 51st state. He slapped on tariffs. He pushed Mark Carney into power specifically to resist American pressure. He thought economic threats would force Canada to accept American terms on everything. But here's what Trump didn't understand. He just gave Canada the motivation to finally do what it should have done decades ago. For years, Canadian Arctic policy had been aspirational. Politicians talked about sovereignty and made promises about infrastructure, but the investments never materialized. The political will wasn't there. Trump changed the calculation overnight. Suddenly, Canada needed alternatives to American markets. Suddenly, diversifying trade routes wasn't just a nice idea, it was an existential necessity. Suddenly, the Arctic went from a theoretical priority to an urgent strategic imperative. Mark Carney saw the opening. His first federal budget in November 2025 included $1 billion over 4 years for Arctic infrastructure. Not for studies, not for planning, for actual construction. Ports, roads, icebreakers, military facilities. The centerpiece was the Port of Churchill Plus project. Churchill is Canada's only Arctic region deep water port. It's connected by rail to the rest of Canada. It sits on Hudson Bay, which connects to the Arctic Ocean and Atlantic shipping routes. For decades, it had been chronically underfunded, barely economically viable. Carney's budget committed $180 million over 5 years just for Churchill, upgrading port facilities, modernizing the railroad, building icebreaking capacity to extend the shipping season from 4 months to potentially year-round operations, creating infrastructure for exporting grain, potash, liquefied natural gas, and critical minerals. But Churchill was just the beginning. The broader Arctic Infrastructure Fund targeted airports in the far north, all-weather roads connecting isolated communities and mining sites, expanded Coast Guard presence, new radar and surveillance systems, military facilities that could support year-round operations, and critically, $7 billion for 2 new heavy icebreakers. Not just any icebreakers, polar-class vessels capable of breaking through 3 meters of ice, operating year-round at temperatures down to minus 50 degrees Celsius. Ships that could establish a permanent Canadian presence in Arctic waters regardless of conditions. The timeline is aggressive. First icebreaker delivery by 2030, second by 2032. Churchill port upgrades beginning immediately. Critical minerals export infrastructure operational within 5 years. This isn't a long-term vision. This is happening now. And here's what the part should terrify Washington. Here's what Trump didn't understand. Physical presence creates legal facts. For decades, the United States could treat the Northwest Passage as international waters because Canada couldn't effectively control it. No ports meant no way to service ships. No icebreakers meant no way to escort or monitor traffic. No military presence meant no way to enforce regulations. That's changing rapidly. Once Canada has icebreakers patrolling year-round, they can require ships to check in, accept Canadian pilots, follow environmental regulations, and pay fees for navigation services. Once there's functioning ports offering refueling and repairs, ships have reasons to comply with Canadian authority rather than risk being denied services. The United States can keep insisting the passage is international waters, but if Canada has the physical infrastructure to regulate traffic, monitor vessels, conduct inspections, and provide essential services, the legal argument becomes increasingly irrelevant. De facto control beats de jure disputes. And here's the strategic nightmare for Washington. China and Russia are watching very carefully. If the United States succeeds
succeeds in treating the Northwest Passage as international waters, that sets a precedent. Chinese vessels can claim the same right of passage, Russian ships too. Any nation can transit without Canadian permission. That's catastrophic for North American security. The entire reason NORAD exists is to defend the continent from threats coming over the Arctic. If hostile nations have unrestricted access to Arctic waters adjacent to North America, that defensive perimeter collapses. Some American strategists have started recognizing this problem. There have been quiet conversations about whether the United States should reconsider its position, whether North American security actually requires supporting Canadian sovereignty over the passage rather than opposing it. But those conversations require Washington to admit it was wrong for 70 years. They require accepting that Canada, not the United States, controls access to a $900 billion trade corridor. They require acknowledging that American pressure on Canada backfired spectacularly. And every month that passes, Canada builds more infrastructure that makes its sovereignty claim more concrete. But here's where it gets really interesting and dangerous.
The great irony is that Trump's pressure on Canada might end up benefiting Russia and China more than anyone. Russia has been building Arctic infrastructure for decades, 50 icebreakers, military bases along the entire northern coast, plans to move 100 million tons of cargo annually through the northern sea route by 2030. Moscow sees the Arctic as central to its economic and strategic future. China calls itself a near-Arctic state despite being nowhere near the Arctic Circle. Beijing has been investing heavily in icebreaker technology, conducting research missions throughout the Arctic Ocean, mapping the seabed, establishing relationships with Arctic nations. For years, Canada and the United States presented a united front against Russian and Chinese Arctic expansion. They might disagree about the Northwest Passage, but they agreed on keeping Moscow and Beijing from dominating the region. Trump's trade war with Canada damaged that unity. When Carney started diversifying Canadian trade partnerships, that included exploring Arctic cooperation with nations the United States wants Canada to resist. Canada hasn't partnered with Russia, that would be too provocative given Ukraine, but Chinese investment in Canadian Arctic projects, that's suddenly on the table in ways it never was before. And if the United States keeps insisting the Northwest Passage is international waters, that directly benefits China. Beijing can claim the right to transit Canadian Arctic waters anytime it wants, using the same legal argument Washington makes. Canada can't stop Chinese vessels if it can't stop American ones. This is Trump's strategic blunder in miniature. He thought he could pressure Canada without consequences. Instead, he pushed Canada toward exactly the kind of Arctic independence and international partnerships that undermine American strategic interests in the region. The transformation of Canada's Arctic is just beginning, but the trajectory is clear. By the early 2030s, Canada will have functioning deepwater ports, permanent icebreaker presence, expanded military infrastructure, and the physical capability to regulate traffic through the Northwest Passage, regardless of what other nations claim about its legal status. The economic benefits are substantial. Canada's critical minerals get to market, shipping companies pay fees for navigation services, northern communities gain employment and infrastructure. Canada establishes itself as a major player in Arctic trade rather than just watching Russia and China dominate. The strategic implications are enormous. North American security improves because Canada can monitor and control who accesses Arctic waters. NATO gains a more capable northern ally. The precedent that allies can successfully resist American pressure gets established for the world to see. And the United States? Washington ends up on the outside of a $900 billion trade corridor, unable to dictate terms, watching Canada build infrastructure that makes American legal arguments increasingly irrelevant. Trump expected Canada to fold. He assumed economic pressure would force Canadian submission, that size meant leverage, that allies had no choice but to accept American demands. Instead, he triggered the largest Canadian Arctic infrastructure investment in history. He gave Canada the motivation to finally back up its sovereignty claims with actual physical presence. He demonstrated to the world that American power isn't as absolute as Washington believes. The empty chair at Trump's negotiating table isn't because Canada is weak. It's because Canada is too busy building an Arctic future that doesn't depend on American permission. And every icebreaker Canada launches, every port it upgrades, every military facility it constructs makes that future more real and American influence more irrelevant. The Arctic is opening, the passage is clearing, and Canada just staked its claim in ways that Washington can't ignore and can no longer prevent. Trump thought he was demonstrating American strength. He accidentally showed the world how to resist it.